So as you've probably guessed, I'm not the only attorney who works in this office. While this is my practice, I don't do everything by myself. I've got a staff that helps me prepare for cases and get things ready to go to trial. And so one day we were doing just that. We were reviewing cases together as trial was approaching on a number of evictions that we had on our dockets. And I was going over a case with one of the associate attorneys, and they mentioned a name that sounded so familiar to me. And I wasn't sure why at first, but it didn't make much of an impact. We took care of the facts of that case and moved on. And it wasn't until I was back at my desk that I decided to look up that name. And so I typed the name into our client management software, and that's when it dawned on me. The same name was attached to 2 evictions at the same time, which isn't generally an issue when you're representing landlords. But the name wasn't one of our landlord clients. It was a tenant. We were evicting the same named tenant from 2 different properties in 2 very different parts of town. So naturally, the first thing I considered was, did we make a mistake? Did we file one or both of these evictions improperly in one of the courts? Was there a mix-up on our end? But sure enough, in both situations, we did everything correctly. I looked at both leases side by side. Both names were spelled exactly the same way. But the real proof was that in both situations, the clients had emailed me a copy of the photo ID of the tenant. In each situation, it was a single tenant, and both times that tenant submitted a photo ID to the landlord as part of the application process. And in each situation, each separate landlord had sent a copy of that ID to me as we prepared to file that eviction. Have you ever been the victim of tenant misrepresentation? Tell us what happened in your case and let us know how that worked out. Why was it that a tenant was occupying 2 separate properties? In both situations, it wasn't at all a matter of a single tenant occupying multiple properties. What was actually going on was that the credit of a tenant was used in both situations, and in neither of these properties was that tenant ever actually seen. It turns out that in both cases, the landlord had never really met the individual who signed the lease. They were familiar with adults who were living on the property, and that at first rent was being paid, but eventually in both situations, rent stopped and an eviction became absolutely necessary. The problem, it turns out, in both cases was that the individual who signed the lease was not properly screened, and the landlord had not met the person who was on the photo ID before handing over those keys. In each instance, the lease was mailed over to the party, the lease was signed digitally and submitted to the landlord. The ID was sent as part of a formality, the requirements of the landlord to substantiate the information that was placed in the application about the person signing, but it never dawned on the landlord that maybe someone was signing on behalf of her and all we were seeing was the person's identification. This is why one of the things that I like to emphasize with landlords is you have to actually see a physical person and a physical ID before you sign a lease agreement. Now, you're going to tell me, Ernie, that's so cumbersome, except that in this situation, that simple step would have prevented a very expensive lawsuit. And Here's the bigger issue. You would have prevented putting in people in place who are likely to default on the lease and who are possibly going to bring harm to the property, because guess what? They have zero liability in this contract because they're not actually the person whose name is signed on the dotted line. What might seem like a cumbersome task is actually a huge way that you protect yourself from these kinds of liabilities. You certainly don't want to put your most valuable asset in the hands of a fake person. Understand that when someone knows they've used a fake name, they're less likely to comply with the terms because there is zero risk for them. Eviction doesn't bother them as much because it's not going on their record, it's going on the record of the individual whose identification was probably stolen. If a landlord had demanded to see that individual to meet them, they very easily could have confirmed that the person in the ID was not the person sitting across from them. And when you get that excuse, well, they couldn't make it, or they have to work during the day, or they sleep during the day because they work nights, or my sister sent me on her behalf because she couldn't make it. She got caught up with the kids at school. These kinds of excuses are fine. If they're legitimate, you simply reschedule. But if you can never actually meet the individual who's featured in the ID, that's a problem. Additionally, if you only ever get a digital copy of that ID, also a problem because digital images can be altered. And it's very easy to change up the name of somebody, to change the driver's license number or the date of birth, so that if you ever do try to perhaps obtain a judgment and then abstract that judgment to create a judgment lien, that judgment lien is absolutely worthless because it's either tied to a name of a person that doesn't actually exist, or the identifying details that you've got are completely false and won't actually yield anything for you in the future. Another problem that each of these landlords missed is that early on in the lease, other people were there who were not mentioned in the lease. I say this often because it is important, and particularly new landlords miss this very simple fact. Having a name is not enough, especially when you know that multiple people will be inhabiting the leasehold. It's important for you to understand exactly who's there at all times. That way, when you go and confirm this, you can match the people who are on the lease with the people who are actually residing on the premises. Let me give you an example. So if you've got a mom and a dad, a man and a woman with names and ages, right? Because you've probably taken each of their IDs because you've required each of these adults to sign as tenants. And then you've got 3 minor children, a 6-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 12-year-old. And each of them is named, and each of their names has beside it their age, so that it's very easy, particularly if you have multiple rentals, it's very easy when you go to this specific rental for you to confirm. If you started out with mom, dad, and 3 kids, but you show up and it's suddenly 5 dudes living there, that can easily be confirmed as flat wrong, and you should do something about it. If they say, oh, well, the family is out, we're staying here and watching the house for them. Well, guess what they have? Either they've got guests, which does that meet the requirements under your lease, particularly for long-term guests, or they've got unauthorized occupants. Either way, you've got some issue that you need to investigate, and you shouldn't take this switcheroo lightly. So along with confirming the physical identity of the individual, and along with identifying all of the occupants who are going to be living on the premises in that lease document, you want to make sure and do a little bit of investigation of the named parties in your lease and their prior landlords. I often tell landlords that the immediate landlord, the one that they're coming from immediately, is sometimes incentivized to be less than honest with you. They might have a hot potato in their hands and they don't want to hold it anymore. They're ditching that hot potato so that you catch it. And if that's the case, they might say things that make their current tenant sound better than they are. They might forget to mention just how often they paid late rent, or just how many times they damaged the property, or how rude they were to them. All that might go out the window because they are eager to see them go. However, that's less likely to happen with the previous landlord. And if you're identifying multiple landlords, the current one and the previous one, you might get a lot more honesty out of that previous landlord because they're gone. There's nothing they can do to overstay at that guy's place. So it's likely that that individual is going to be the most honest with you about their payment history, about the way they treated the property, and about the way they interacted with that landlord. So part of investigating your tenants, again, before you ever sign that lease, includes checking out what that named tenant was in the past. If my clients in this situation had done that simple step, they would have found that a previous landlord would have said many of the same kinds of things they experienced. I never actually met that individual. It turns out that other people were living there and I could never get a hold of the individual who signed the lease. As soon as the lease was signed, they stopped responding to my emails. That landlord may also say, you know, I actually had to evict them because of what they did to my property. What we later found out from other landlords was this same name was used multiple times all around the city of Houston. That there were some people who were selling opportunities to tenants who otherwise couldn't get into certain homes because of their eviction history and because of the number of times they had already been rejected. Someone was out there promising, we can get you in a home because your credit will not be a problem if we handle it for you. And unfortunately, landlords who didn't know to take these extra steps were fooled into signing leases with a fake tenant. If you learned something today, we appreciate a like. Any questions or comments, let me know. I'll answer those myself. And if you're not yet a subscriber, please consider subscribing. Now, for those of you who come to this channel often and are eager to learn even more about landlording, I strongly recommend you check out this video right here, which YouTube seems to think is the next best thing for you. I welcome you to look at that and all the rest of the content that we've got on this channel. But until next time, landlords, always we wish you the best and happy leasing.